Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Somewhere out there, right now, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, on a world that looks, on the surface, exactly like every other world in the Imperium of man, something is being whispered. Maybe it's being whispered in the back of a chemical processing plant while the machinery groans and the workers breathe recycled air so stale it tastes like rust. Maybe it's being whispered in a carved-out chamber beneath a hive city, where the only light is a single candle and the only company is a collection of faces that can only meet like this because they've all agreed, quietly, that they can trust each other. Maybe it's being whispered inside what looks, to any passing our Bites patrol, like a perfectly ordinary trade guild meeting or a charitable congregation or a local prayer circle devoted to the God Emperor himself. But if you listened closely enough, if you peeled back the outer skin of the thing and looked at what was actually being said, what was actually being passed hand to hand in the form of pamphlets and symbols and small tokens of recognition, you would understand immediately that this is something else entirely. Something older, something hungrier, something that has been spreading through the body of the Imperium for 10,000 years and has never, not once, truly been stopped. This is how a chaos cult is born. And this, all of this, is what we're going to talk about today. I want to take you on a journey, not a fast one, not a surface-level look at cultists and their tattoos. I want to go deep. And I want to trace this thing from its absolute beginning, from the very nature of the warp itself and the chaos gods who wait inside it, all the way through the patient, grinding, whisper by whisper process by which an entire planet can be turned from a loyal servant of the Emperor into a screaming offering laid at the feet of the ruinous powers. I want to show you how it works, not just what happens, but why. Not just who the cults recruit, but how they make it feel like a good idea to join. Because here's the thing that makes chaos cults genuinely terrifying, more terrifying than any open invasion, more frightening than any alien fleet. They don't look like what they are until it's too late. They wear the face of comfort, of belonging, of answered prayers. By the time the mask comes off, there are enough of them that it almost doesn't matter anymore. Let's start at the very beginning. Before the first whispering demagogue, before the first symbol carved into flesh, before the first world fell to heresy. Let's start with the place where all of this comes from. Let's start with the warp. Section 2. The warp. The ocean beneath reality. Picture, if you will, an ocean. Not the kind with gentle waves and seabirds, the kind that exists in a nightmare. A churning, lightless expanse with no floor and no surface, where pressure works in every direction at once, and the things that live inside it don't have names or faces, because they're not made of matter at all. They're made of emotion, of hunger, as of the accumulated weight of every feeling that has ever been felt by every sentient creature in the galaxy, folded and compressed and shaped into something vast and ancient and utterly without mercy. This is the warp. This is the Imperium. This is the place that sits directly underneath the material universe, like a shadow that has decided to become its own thing. The warp is not a metaphor. In the universe of Warhammer 40,000, it is as real as the stars. It is a parallel dimension of pure psychic energy, what the Adeptus Mechanicus reluctantly calls the Imperium. What the superstitious masses of the Imperium refer to in hushed voices as simply the warp, or the Empyrean, and what the servants of the dark gods call the realm of chaos, the sea of souls, or most ominously of all, the primordial truth. Every thought, as every emotion, every act of love or fear or rage or despair that occurs anywhere in the galaxy leaves a mark in the warp. Not metaphorically, literally. The warp is responsive to consciousness the way water is responsive to heat. When enough emotion concentrates and coalesces in a particular way, it creates things, shapes, presences. The warp breeds entities that are literally made from mortal feeling, and the most powerful, the most ancient, the most terrifyingly coherent of these entities are what we call the Chaos Gods. There are 4 of them, and they have been waiting, growing, feeding, and scheming since before recorded history. Khorne came first, and he is the simplest to understand, which does not make him any less frightening. He is the god of violence, rage, war, and blood. He exists because every act of killing, as every explosion of berserker fury, every moment when a creature decides to take what it wants by force, all of that psychic energy, all of that raw aggression flows into the warp and feeds him. He is immense. He is ancient. He hates sorcery because sorcery is thought and patience, and he has no use for either of those things. What he wants is blood, not even the blood of his enemies specifically. Khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. He is the sound of a jaw-shattering headbutt turned into a god. Tzeentch came next, though next is a deceptive word for a being that exists partially outside of time. He is the god of change, mutation, sorcery, ambition, and scheming. But he exists because of the twin impulses of hope and the desire for change, both the drive to make things better and the drive to make things different. Every plotter, every ambitious noble, every psyker reaching for knowledge they probably shouldn't have, every revolutionary who dreams of burning the old world down and building something new in the ashes, all of that feeds Tzeentch. He loves plans. He loves schemes within schemes. He loves the moment when a plan that looks certain falls apart and something unexpected blooms from the wreckage. The joke, of course, is that Tzeentch's own plans rarely have any coherent final goal, because change for its own sake is all he truly wants. Tzeentch is sometimes known as the changer of ways, and he wears 1,000 masks, and behind none of them is any face at all. Then there is Nurgle, the Plague Lord, the grandfather of pestilence. He is, in many ways, the most unsettling of the 4, because he is the god of death and decay and disease. And yet his followers love him back. They genuinely love him. Nurgle exists because of the universal mortal experience of suffering through illness, of watching someone you love decay and die, of the desperate bargain that every conscious creature eventually makes with its own mortality. He is entropy given form. He is the awareness of death that lives in every living thing. And he is, according to his followers, a jolly, generous, almost fatherly figure who embraces his children no matter what they look like, no matter how rotted, no matter how corrupted. There is a horrible logic to Nurgle's appeal that we will come back to in considerable detail. Finally, Slaanesh, was the youngest of the 4, the Dark Prince, the Lord of Excess. Slaanesh was born from the fall of the Eldari, an ancient, psychically powerful alien civilization that destroyed itself by collectively wallowing in hedonism so extreme that the psychic resonance of their collective pleasure tore a hole in reality and birthed a new god, screaming into existence. That hole still exists, by the way. It's called the Eye of Terror, and it's one of the most terrifying locations in the galaxy. Slaanesh is the god of sensation, pleasure, pain, perfection, excess, and obsession. Slaanesh exists because every living creature has desires, from the mildest to the most twisted, and all of that wanting, all of that craving, all of that desperate need for more feeds the Dark Prince. Slaanesh doesn't distinguish between beautiful and ugly, between loving and cruel, between art and atrocity. All sensation is food. These 4 entities, these 4 enormous, incomprehensible, planet-drowning presences exist in the warp, and they are hungry. They are always hungry. And here is the thing you need to understand that makes everything else about chaos cults make sense. They cannot simply reach into the material universe and take what they want, not directly. The barrier between the warp and real space is thin in some places, but it is not gone everywhere, not all the time. The Chaos Gods need agents. They need bridges. They need mortals, human beings, living in the material world, breathing recycled air in the underhive or sleeping in noble beds in the upper spire, who will, willingly or not, open the door from this side. That is what a chaos cult is. Us at the deepest structural level. Not a gathering of sadists, though those exist. Not a collection of idiots who didn't know what they were getting into, though those exist too. A chaos cult is a door through which the power of the warp can enter the material world. And the chaos gods are endlessly creative, endlessly patient, and endlessly generous with their promises in the business of building those doors. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to keep those doors closed. 10,000 years of inquisitors and sisters of battle, and planetary lockdowns and mass purges. 10,000 years of burning whole populations to ash on the off chance that they might have been compromised. And still the cults grow. Still the whispers spread. Still the doors open. Why? Well, because of something built deep into the structure of the Imperium itself. Something the Emperor's architects, for all their genius, could not or would not fix. Section 3. The Imperium's fatal architecture. Let me describe a hive city. It is enormous, not just big, staggeringly, city-swallowingly, skyline-buryingly enormous. A single hive city might house 10 billion people, stacked in layers that reach kilometers into the sky and burrow just as deep into the earth below. The upper spire is where the wealthy live, and up there it almost looks civilized. There are clean air recyclers and processed protein that taste something like food and windows that look out at the stars. And if you're very high up and very wealthy, so you might even have a view that isn't blocked by the next spire over. The people up there aren't happy. No one in the 41st millennium is truly happy, but they are at least comfortable in their misery. But most people don't live in the spire. Most people live in the mid-hive, in stacked hab blocks that are basically cages with beds, where the air tastes like machine oil and old sweat, and the walls are close enough to touch on both sides at once. They work, they come home, they sleep, they work again, for their entire lives. Their parents did the same, their grandparents did the same, and as far as anyone in the mid-hive can see, their children will do the same. The Imperium does not promise mobility. It promises duty. But it's the underhive that matters most for our story, because the underhive is where the city gives up entirely. The underhive is the accumulated wreckage of centuries of building, abandonment, and collapse. It's where the recyclers don't quite reach, where the lights are broken, and no one has fixed them for a generation, where the mutants huddle in corners, and the gangs rule by violence alone, because there is no Arbite's presence that extends this deep. The underhive is where you go when you have nothing left to lose. It is dark, it is hungry, it is desperate. And desperate people, as any student of history will tell you, are extraordinarily susceptible to promises. The Adeptus Mechanicus has a saying, knowledge is power. The Chaos Gods know something more specific. Desperation is a door. Give a human being a life of unrelenting suffering, of grinding poverty, of watching their children starve while they labor for masters they will never meet on behalf of an emperor they have never seen. And that person becomes extraordinarily open to the idea that things could be different, that there might be something more, that someone, somewhere, is willing to offer them a better deal. And the deal doesn't even have to be good. That's the genius of it. The Imperium, for all its immense power, has a structural flaw that is baked directly into its design. It is a government by absolute divine mandate, run by institutions that are simultaneously ossified by 10,000 years of tradition and paralyzed by their own internal politics, administering 1,000,000 worlds through a bureaucratic apparatus so enormous that a message sent from one end of it sometimes takes decades to arrive. And it is a civilization that survives by maintaining a state of perpetual, barely controlled crisis. The Adeptus Terra needs its tithe, so the planetary governors extract it, so the local administrators squeeze it out of the workers, so the workers have just enough to live on and not one crumb more. There is no social safety net in the Imperium. There is no unemployment benefit, no healthcare system accessible to the mass of humanity, no pension, no retirement. There is work and there is death. And between those two things, there is the Imperial Creed. the worship of the God Emperor, which offers the comfort of meaning in suffering and the promise of a better existence in death. That's it. That's the complete package the Imperium offers its 10 trillion souls. Work, suffer, worship, die. This is not cynicism on my part. This is the explicit reality of how the Imperium functions, acknowledged by its own scholars, its own priests, its own inquisitors. The Ordo Hereticus, the branch of the Inquisition specifically tasked with hunting chaos cults, has produced internal assessments acknowledging that chaos cults arise from any class of imperial society, from the impoverished to the noble, to the hive gang, to the abhuman, to the soldier. They aren't a problem of the lower classes alone, they are a problem of the entire structure. Because here's the other thing about the Imperium's architecture. The more civilized a society becomes, the more leisure, the more luxury, the more room for desire beyond mere survival, the more fertile the soil becomes for certain gods. Khorne can find followers anywhere there is violence. Shetsench can find followers anywhere there are psychers and ambitious intellectuals. Nurgle can find followers anywhere there is disease and grief. But Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Excess, does some of his best work in the upper spire, among the comfortable and the bored, among the people who have had everything they're supposed to want and have discovered that it isn't enough. So the Imperium creates chaos cult conditions at every level of its society simultaneously. The desperately poor in the underhive are ripe. The intellectually frustrated mid-level administrator who suspects that the reality of the universe is more complex than the imperial creed allows, is ripe. The jaded nobleman who has sampled every pleasure his civilization offers and found them tasteless, is ripe. The veteran soldier who has seen too much death to make sense of anything, is ripe. The grieving parent who watched their child die of a disease that a better supplied medikit could have prevented, is ripe. Let's go even deeper into why the Imperium is structurally incapable of fixing this problem. Because it isn't ignorance. The High Lords of Terror, the Senior Inquisitors, the Sector Lords and Planetary Governors, they know the conditions exist. They have reports. They have centuries of documentation describing exactly what breeds cult activity, exactly which environmental factors most reliably produce chaos worshippers, exactly which communities are statistically most at risk. They know. They just cannot act on the knowledge without dismantling the mechanisms that hold the Imperium together. Take taxation. The Administratum's tithe system is one of the central organizing facts of imperial life. Every world must provide. What it provides, soldiers, manufactured goods, raw materials, agricultural output, varies by world type and agreement. But nothing varies the requirement to provide. Even worlds suffering plague outbreaks. Even worlds recovering from orc raids. Even worlds where a volcanic event or tidal catastrophe has just killed a third of the population. The tithe continues, not because the Administratum is cruel, though individual Administratum officials certainly can be, but because the tithe is what pays for the Astra Militarum, which is the only thing standing between most of the Imperium and annihilation by Xenos or Chaos forces. If the tithes slow, the regiments dissolve, and the galaxy eats the Imperium alive. The machine is not optional, but the machine creates conditions. A world that has just lost a significant chunk of its workforce to a plague is now asked to meet the same tithe it always has. The planetary governor has several options, none of them good. Extract the tithe from a diminished workforce by working them harder, which destroys morale and productivity over time. Request an exemption from the Administratum, which takes years to process and may not be granted. Simply not meet the tithe and face consequences, or quietly restructure the local economy in ways that accomplish the extraction without officially changing anything, which usually means the people at the bottom are squeezed harder while the people at the top maintain their comfortable margins. This is the pattern that plays out on 1,000 worlds simultaneously. And the cumulative effect, over decades and centuries, is a working population that has internalized two contradictory ideas simultaneously. The Emperor loves them and protects them, and their lives are getting progressively harder with no end in sight. That cognitive dissonance is a door. It is specifically the kind of dissonance that a well-placed demagogue can work with, because the resolution they offer, the Emperor has abandoned you, but something else hasn't, provides the relief of a coherent worldview that still acknowledges the reality of suffering without requiring the sufferer to blame themselves for it. Then there's the problem of information. The Imperium controls information with the intensity of an institution that genuinely believes knowledge can be as lethal as a bolter round. Most of it is. Just the Adeptus Mechanicus holds the secrets of technology behind rituals and restricted databases. The Inquisition classifies vast swaths of knowledge about the true nature of the threats humanity faces. The Ecclesiarchy manages the theological framework through which the population is meant to interpret their reality. The result is that the average imperial citizen, even an educated one, lives in an information environment that has been quite deliberately structured to keep certain conclusions unreachable. The problem is that reality keeps leaking through. Things happen that don't fit the official explanations. People die in ways the imperial creed doesn't account for. Phenomena occur that the official doctrine says are impossible. And when ordinary channels don't offer satisfying answers, people look for other channels. The person who finds a chaos text, or who encounters a demagogue who claims to have answers, is not, in that moment, searching for damnation. They are searching for truth. They are searching for a framework that actually fits what they can observe. The fact that the framework being offered is heretical doesn't feel like heresy from the inside. It feels like relief. This is the information architecture problem that the Imperium cannot solve without openness that its own security apparatus won't allow. The more effectively the official information channels are controlled, the more valuable any alternative channel becomes. The chaos cults offer an alternative channel, one that claims to have access to the real truths that the Imperium suppresses. And in a specific, deeply uncomfortable sense, they do. The warp is real. The chaos gods are real. The fact that acknowledging their reality leads people towards something catastrophic doesn't make the reality itself false. The chaos gods look at this and they see a garden. The Imperium has planted it for them. All the ruinous powers need to do is show up with seeds. Section 4. The first whisper, how a cult is born. It starts, almost always, with a single person. Not a monster. Not someone who looks like a cartoon of evil, who walks around with a skull-faced helm and a banner marked with the 8-pointed star of chaos. Not yet. It starts with someone who looks, to all outward appearances, like a perfectly ordinary member of whatever community they're embedded in. Someone who might be a shift supervisor in a manufactorum, or a low-ranking priest in a chapel dedicated to the Emperor, or a street-level medici in the underhive who treats wounds that the official Arbeits healers won't touch. What makes this person different from their neighbours? They found something, or something has found them. The warp doesn't require an invitation, not initially. Its influence can seep through in a dozen ways. A psyker who hasn't yet manifested their gift starts dreaming. A community that has experienced a trauma, a disease outbreak, a collapse that killed 100 workers, an Arbeits purge that took people who didn't deserve it, develops a crack in its collective faith, a moment of why didn't the Emperor protect us, and through that crack something slides. A merchant gets a book from a trader that turns out to contain more than merchant records. Whereas a scholar in a planetary library discovers a sealed archive that was supposed to have been destroyed and starts reading. The specific trigger doesn't matter as much as the feeling that follows. The sense of something more, something real, something that explains why the world is the way it is. Something that offers either power or meaning or simple comfort, depending on which of the four gods is doing the reaching and which vulnerability they found in this particular person. Scholars who study the phenomenon, inquisitors and their acolytes who have spent decades tracking cult formation and lived to write their reports, describe this initial stage as the seeding phase. The first convert almost never knows exactly what they've become. They experience their growing affinity for the warp as revelation, as clarity. But the demagogue who will eventually lead their community into fire usually starts out genuinely believing they found a better path. And then they start talking to people they trust. This is the second moment, the very first recruitment. The first cultist doesn't open their mouth in the town square. They don't announce their new faith over the Voxnet. They go to their closest friend or their sibling or the one person in their immediate social circle who they know is struggling, who they know has been asking the same questions they used to ask, who they know is not going to go running to the Arbeits. They share a little. They offer comfort. They don't lead with the heresy. They lead with the answer to the problem. If the plant medicine goes to a family whose child is dying of a fever, the administratum doesn't have funds to treat and offers them something that works. The street preacher goes to the man whose wife died in an industrial accident that was definitely the Forge Master's fault, and tells him there are powers in this universe who will listen to his rage. This is not random. This is targeted. The Chaos Gods reward this kind of patient, careful, personalized recruitment because it works. A single act of genuine help, of actual comfort in a place where comfort is rarely offered, creates a bond of loyalty that is extraordinarily hard to break. The person who gave you something when you had nothing is not easily abandoned, even when you start to realize that the context they provided that gift in was not what you first understood it to be. But the cult has begun, but it's still invisible. The Adeptus Arbites and the Inquisition understand this in theory. They know the pattern. They know what to look for. But here's the mathematics problem that makes hunting cults in their early stages so brutal. The Imperium has 1 million worlds, and each world can have billions of people, and the Arbites and Inquisitors together are a tiny number of eyes watching an incomprehensible amount of human activity. By the time a cult is visible enough to detect through normal Arbites methods, it is usually already too late to stop it quietly. So, what does the cult look like in its first few months? 2 people, maybe 3, meeting somewhere private, an empty maintenance corridor, the back of a Hadblock storage unit, a cellar beneath a chapel, talking quietly, sharing things. So the conversations at this stage are less about ritual and more about understanding. What did you think about that dream? Have you noticed how different things feel when you let yourself feel what you actually feel? Do you think the Emperor's light reaches the underhive? Do you think it was ever really meant to? These are theological and philosophical conversations, but they function as a net. They identify who is open to further progression. Not everyone who asks hard questions about faith is a potential cultist, but everyone who is a potential cultist asks hard questions about faith. The first generation recruits are sorted more or less naturally, and those who are ready, who have the right combination of grievance and openness and willingness to seek, are brought a little deeper. Just the demagogue at the center of a chaos cult is the critical piece. They are, almost without exception, people of genuine charisma, of genuine intelligence. They have to be, because what they're doing requires an extraordinary ability to read people, to sense what each individual needs, to tailor the promise accordingly. They offer power to those who feel powerless. They offer family to those who are alone. They offer meaning to those who feel their lives are pointless. They offer healing to those who are sick. They offer justice to those who have been wronged. They offer beauty to those who have been denied it. Everything they offer is real, at least in the beginning. The warp does grant power. It does create community. It does offer forms of healing that conventional imperial medicine can't touch. Just the problem, the trap that snaps shut so gradually that most people inside it don't even notice, is what those gifts cost. Not in terms of any stated price, in terms of what each act of service to the ruinous powers does to a soul. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk first about how they stay hidden while they grow. Section 5. Hiding in plain sight. Fronts, cells, and secrets. The moment a chaos cult grows beyond 2 or 3 people, it faces an existential problem. The Imperium of Man considers heresy, any deviation from the imperial creed, any worship of powers other than the Emperor, to be a capital offense, not a fine, not prison, death, swift, thorough, and often extended to the immediate family and neighbours of the guilty party on the grounds that the taint may have spread. The Inquisition, which has the authority to condemn an entire planet if the situation warrants it, is not a subtle instrument when it finally acts. Cults that get caught get burned, so they don't get caught. Or more accurately, they work extraordinarily hard not to get caught. And the methods they use to stay invisible are clever enough that they deserve our full attention. The first and most important technique is the front organization. In the records of the Ordo Hereticus, there is a consistent pattern in the documentation of cults discovered and destroyed. Almost every successful cult of any size has hidden itself behind some form of legitimate organization, trade unions, charitable associations, or burial societies. Groups that help families pay for the internment of their dead, which are extremely common in hive cities where official services are expensive. Variant sects of the imperial creed itself, philosophical discussion groups, mutual aid organizations, political movements advocating for better working conditions. All of these are real. They do real work. The charitable association does actually distribute food to hungry families. The trade union does actually negotiate with the forge masters. The philosophical circle does actually discuss genuine questions of theology and imperial history. This is not purely camouflage, it's recruitment infrastructure. The front organization identifies the vulnerable and the disaffected. It creates a sense of community and belonging that the imperial system has failed to provide, as it establishes trust. And then, very carefully, very gradually, the inner circle of the organization begins to introduce certain members to certain things. Not everyone in the front organization is a cultist, not even close. Some members of the trade union are just workers who want better air filters in the manufactorum. The outer members serve as genuine cover because they genuinely have no idea what the inner circle is doing. If the Arbites investigate the organization, the outer members pass questioning easily because they're not lying. They joined a charity. They have no idea that the people running it have been holding completely different meetings in a completely different location for the past 6 months. The inner circle, the true cultists, typically operates on a cellular structure. As this is not an accident or an improvisation. It is a deliberate design feature that reflects thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to survive inquisitorial scrutiny. A cell is a small group of people, typically no more than 10 or 15, who know each other but who know very little about the cult's broader structure. If one cell is discovered and its members are taken by the Arbites, they genuinely cannot reveal the locations and identities of other cells because they don't know them. The damage is contained. The organization survives. The way cells communicate with each other is through carefully managed intermediaries, dead drops, and code systems that look like ordinary commerce or correspondence to anyone without the specific keys to decode them. A cargo manifest might hide a message. A particular arrangement of market stalls might signal a meeting location. An apparently religious icon placed in a particular window might indicate that it's safe to approach a contact. The tradecraft of a well-run chaos cult would be recognizable to any intelligence professional from any era of history, because the problems being solved are the same problems that any clandestine organization has always faced. One of the most fascinating and unsettling details from the lore is the technique known as the bone brand. Cultists carry a specific brand, burned or carved into their flesh, typically somewhere concealed under clothing, that identifies them to other members of the cult without revealing anything to outsiders. The placement is usually somewhere practical: the inner forearm, the shoulder blade, the upper thigh. On the brand itself is not a screaming skull or an 8-pointed star of chaos. Those are the brands of later stages of devotion, when concealment matters less. The early stage bone brand is something that could plausibly be a local tattoo tradition, a gang mark, a memorial, a purely personal design. But to anyone who knows what to look for, it says, "This person is one of us." Consider what this means in practice. The Arbites patrol a hab block and stop someone for questioning. The person's papers are in order. They work at a registered manufactorum. They attend their local chapel. Their neighbors, if asked, describe them as quiet, helpful, unremarkable. The Arbeits pats them down, perhaps notices a faded mark on their forearm, decides it looks like an old gang tattoo, common enough in the underhive, and moves on. Usually what the Arbeits officer doesn't know is that the same mark on 12 other people in this hab block alone is the identifying symbol of a cult that has been operating in this district for 4 years. And then there's the question of the languages they speak to each other. Cult terminology evolves to create an insider vocabulary that sounds innocent to anyone who isn't already part of the group. The gathering might mean a specific ritual meeting rather than any ordinary gathering. The teacher might refer to the demagogue rather than any actual teacher. The gift might mean a chaos mutation. Finding peace might mean achieving a state of warp-touched bliss that looks, from the outside, like ordinary contentment. The language does two things simultaneously. It facilitates communication and it builds group identity. Speaking the cult's language is itself an act of belonging. It creates the sense that this group of people has a shared reality that the outside world doesn't understand, which is both true and an extraordinarily effective psychological bonding mechanism. Now let's talk about what each of the 4 gods cults specifically looks for in their recruits, because not all cults are the same. The ruinous powers attract different people, and the specific techniques they use reflect the nature of what each god offers. Section 6. The 4 flavors of damnation. There is a document, believed to be genuine, circulated among senior inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus. It is not a pleasant read, as it contains detailed psychological profiles of the most common pathways to each form of chaos devotion, not to understand the cultists with compassion, but to identify them before they reach the next stage of their development. The document is matter of fact about something that should disturb all of us. The ruinous powers are good at this. They have been doing it for 10,000 years. They know which buttons to push. Let's go through them. Khorne. The blood gods gathering. Khorne's cults are the ones people expect when they think about chaos cults. Bloody, violent, frenzied, built around ritualized murder. And in their fully developed form, that description is accurate. But the path that leads there is more nuanced than it looks. Khorne's initial reach tends toward people already embedded in violence, with soldiers, particularly veterans who have fought in wars so savage and so pointless that they have come to understand violence not as a tool, but as a force of nature. Hive gangers who have grown up in environments where physical dominance is the only currency that matters. Arena fighters, underhive executioners, people who kill for hire or for status and have stopped feeling anything particular about it. People who have been victims of extreme violence and whose trauma has curdled into rage they can't put down. The initial appeal of Khorne is not presented as worship. It is presented as permission. The blood gods' cults, in their early stages, don't tell new recruits, "You should murder people in the name of a dark god." They tell recruits something like, "Your anger is real. Your rage is righteous. The system that has wronged you is real, and there is a power in the universe that sees your rage and affirms it, that says it is not something to be suppressed or managed, but something to be unleashed. You have been told your whole life to keep your head down, to accept the injustice, to trust that the Emperor will provide, and you know, don't you, that this is a lie. Your anger knows the truth. Let it breathe." This is seductive for a very specific psychological profile, and the Chaos Gods have had 10,000 years to identify that profile and craft their pitch accordingly. The person who has been telling themselves that their rage is wrong, that they need to control it, that good people keep their violence locked inside, that person is exhausted. They have been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and the cult offers to let them put it down, not to direct it constructively. Khorne has no interest in constructive, but simply to let it go, to let it explode outward, and to be told that this is not a sin, but a sacrament. The bone brand of a Khornate cult is usually burned in, literally. a scar of particular design, raised and keloid, because the blood god appreciates dedication that costs something physical. Initiates are often asked to perform an act of violence as proof of their commitment. And this is not always something dramatic. It might be the deliberate humiliation of someone who has wronged a cult member. It might be the destruction.
Honestly, this is the part of 40k lore that got me, like genuinely hooked in a way that the battles and the Space Marines never quite did on their own. Because there's something deeply uncomfortable about how plausible all of this is. The Imperium creates misery on an industrial scale, and then it acts surprised when people go looking for something. Anything that feels like an answer. Like, you read about a Nurgle cult forming in an underhive where people are literally dying of preventable disease, and you don't hate the cultists, you just feel sad. That's the thing Games Workshop gets right. Chaos isn't evil for the sake of being evil, it's a mirror, and sometimes the mirror is a little too honest for comfort. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Of a piece of imperial property that carries symbolic weight. It escalates, always. The acts that were sufficient last month are no longer sufficient this month, as the blood god's demands only grow. In a fully mature Hornate cult, the ritual gatherings have become organized violence, either against outsiders or, in the most extreme cases, between cult members themselves, because Khorne truly cares not from whence the blood flows, and his followers eventually internalize this completely. The World Eater's Traitor Legion, once a functioning Space Marine legion, and now a collection of frenzied warbands scattering carnage across the galaxy, embodies what happens when Hornate devotion reaches its absolute terminus. But that's the end of the road. Most people who join a blood cult start with something much smaller, much more human, just anger and permission. The sociological profile of a Hornate cult reflects this. They tend to be predominantly military or criminal in membership. Must they recruit from veteran populations, from arena circuits, from hive gang hierarchies, where a fight to the death is considered a perfectly normal way to settle a dispute? The cult's front organizations are typically legitimate-seeming organizations focused on martial culture, fighting schools, veterans' mutual aid societies, athletic organizations. The violence that they do has always been there. The cult just gives it direction and divine sanction. Nurgle, the grandfather's embrace. If Khorne's cults are the most obvious, Nurgle's are the most tragic. Because what Nurgle offers, what pulls people into his orbit, is not power or permission or pleasure. It is comfort, and comfort offered to someone who desperately needs it and has nowhere else to find it is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. What the plague, God's recruiting grounds, are the places where the Imperium has most completely failed its people. Hospices where the dying lie in rows with no Medicae attending to them, because the Medicae budget was redirected to the Astra Militarum. Leper colonies outside hive cities, where the physically deformed or disease-ridden are deposited to die slowly, out of sight. Slums so deep in the underhive that clean water is a luxury item. Any place where disease is endemic and untreated, where watching someone you love die painfully is considered an ordinary part of life. Nurgle's cults typically approach the dying, literally. And a Nurgle cultist operating in early-stage recruitment will show up at the bedside of someone who has been told nothing can be done for them. Someone whose family has prayed at the chapel and been given nothing but sympathy, whose condition has been noted by the administratum, and whose existence has been deemed not worth the cost of treatment. And the cultist will offer them something that actually helps, a compound that slows the progression of their illness, a technique that manages pain in a way the official Medicae doesn't know about, a community of others in the same situation who are there, physically present, who hold the dying person's hand and tell them they are not alone. This is how Nurgle's reach is wider than any of the other gods. Just the specificity of Khorne's appeal. You need to already be someone who has normalized violence, limits his recruitment pool. Tzeentch needs ambition and intellectual curiosity, characteristics that are present but not universal. Slaanesh needs a certain developed capacity for excess, also not everyone. But Nurgle? Disease touches everyone. Grief touches everyone. The fear of death touches everyone. The desperate wish that a loved one would not have to suffer touches everyone. Nurgle can recruit from absolutely any demographic, from any culture, from any class level, because suffering is truly universal. The insidious thing, the aspect that makes inquisitors who study Nurgle's cults write increasingly distressed reports, is that the early stage gifts are real. The disease does slow, the pain does ease, as the community does provide genuine comfort. The grandfather's embrace feels, from the inside, genuinely caring. His followers frequently describe a sense of joy, of release, of liberation from the constant dread of death, because they have been promised that in Nurgle's service, death is not an ending, but a transformation, a passage from one form of beloved existence to another. His realm is described, by those who have glimpsed it, as a garden, chaotic, rotten, filled with bloated and decaying things, but blooming nevertheless. What the initiates are not told, what they discover only gradually as they progress deeper into the cult's structures, is what Nurgle's gifts actually do to a person. The diseases that his dedicated cultists carry are not just illnesses, they are living things, blessings, as the faithful call them, that reshape the body in ways that progressively separate the devotee from ordinary human life. A fully blessed Nurgle cultist is not something that can walk among ordinary people without causing immediate alarm. But by the time they reach that stage, they don't want to walk among ordinary people. They want to be in the embrace of their grandfather, surrounded by others who understand, who are also transformed, who see the rot and the bloom together. The plague cults tend to have more structured internal hierarchies than cornate cults, because they require more coordination, the distribution of medicinal and disease-spreading compounds, the management of hospice fronts, the careful concealment of increasingly visible mutations. The leader of a Nurgle cult is typically a figure who has been living with Nurgle's gifts for long enough that they have stopped appearing to be human in any conventional sense, but who has somehow managed to remain coherent enough to lead, which requires either the isolated compound they meet in to be somewhere the outer world never reaches, or a very effective way of keeping the leader away from any public-facing activities. The Changer's net of promises, Chi's cults are the most difficult to detect and the most intellectually complex in their structure, reflecting the nature of a god whose entire existence is devoted to scheming and change. The Changer of Ways does not primarily recruit through desperation, though he can and does use it. What he recruits through ambition and through the specific hunger of the intellectually curious. The Psyker who knows they have gifts that the black ships will come to collect, who knows that the Inquisition's sanctioning process is a diminishment of what they could be, who has felt the genuine vast reach of the warp and been told to be afraid of it rather than to explore it. That person is extraordinarily vulnerable to a teacher who tells them the fear is unnecessary, that the power is real, that there is no ceiling on what they could become if they were willing to learn without limits. The scholar who has found, in some hidden corner of a planetary library, texts that contradict the official imperial account of history. The administrator who has begun to notice patterns in the flow of information through their office that suggests someone, as somewhere, is managing a reality much more complex than they're allowed to know. The merchant who has discovered that the most profitable trade routes in the sector are controlled by a network of relationships that has nothing to do with the official commercial guilds, and who wants in. All of these are Tsenschian recruitment profiles. Tsench's cults are organized like layered mysteries, not cells in the security sense of the cornate or Nurgle structure, though operational security is very much present, but concentric circles of initiation. The outer circle knows a little, the middle circle knows more. The inner circle knows the actual nature of what they serve. And there is always another circle beyond the current one that promises still more knowledge, still more power, still more understanding of how the universe truly works. This structure is genuinely brilliant as a retention mechanism, because a person who has been given forbidden knowledge, who has been told secrets that no one outside this group possesses, develops a fierce attachment to access to those secrets. Even if the outer circle begins to suspect that something is wrong, they have been given enough real information, enough genuine power, because Tzeentch's gifts of sorcery and precognition are real, that walking away means walking away from the most interesting and powerful experience of their life. And there is always the promise of more. The front organizations for Tzeentchian cults tend to be intellectually prestigious, philosophical societies, arcane research groups, academic institutions, banking conglomerates, trading networks. Tzeentch's following skews more heavily toward the educated, the ambitious, and the privileged than any other chaos powers. This makes his cult simultaneously more difficult for the Arbites to pursue. You cannot simply raid the local chapter of the Planetary Governors Literary Society without very good evidence. And more dangerous, because the inner circle of a Tzeentchian cult often consists of people who occupy positions of genuine institutional power within the Imperium. There is a specific horror in the idea that the magistrate who is supposed to review the evidence for a cult investigation has themselves been part of a cult for 12 years, or that the senior Arbitese commander, who is supposed to authorize the raid, has been attending inner circle meetings every third month for the past decade. Tzeentch's cults, as at their most developed, don't subvert institutions from outside. They fill them from within. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince's long seduction. Slaanesh's cults are, in many ways, the most fascinating and the most illustrative of how the Chaos Gods work with human psychology specifically. Because what Slaanesh targets is not violence, not desperation, not ambition in the conventional sense, but desire. And desire is universal. The Dark Prince's initial approach is often not recognizable as religious at all. It begins with something that looks like community, like art, like the simple discovery that pleasure is possible in a life that otherwise offers very little of it. A gathering of nobles who share a love of a particular kind of music, as a salon in the upper spire, where artists and poets and people who consider themselves sophisticated gather to share work. A private club in the mid-hive, where workers who want something other than the standard recreational options, standard issue Amasec and Exhaustion and the vid screens, come to find more interesting company. These are the outer ring of Slaanesh's recruitment structure, and the experience they provide is genuinely pleasurable. The music is extraordinary, the art is beautiful, the company is stimulating. The substances being consumed are better than anything available through official channels. And the host, the demagogue, the one who is actually working for the Dark Prince, is subtle, never pushing, always providing, creating an environment where people feel free to express desires they would normally keep hidden, where there is no judgment, where nothing is considered excess as long as it pleases. The escalation happens so slowly that most initiates genuinely cannot identify the moment it became something else. First, it was just a gathering of interesting people enjoying fine things. Then it was a gathering where certain taboos were broken. Nothing dramatic, just minor violations of imperial propriety that felt like liberation. Then it was something that would be socially ruinous if it became known. And now the host has leverage, gentle leverage, held so carefully and warmly that it barely feels like leverage at all. Then it was something that would draw Arbite's attention. And then it was a ritual. And by the time an initiate in a Slaaneshian cult is participating in actual devotional acts that explicitly honor the Dark Prince rather than simply serving his influence, they are typically so deeply embedded, both socially and in terms of what they have already done, that extraction is nearly impossible. The social bonds are total, the secrets being kept are mutual and binding. The experiences have become the most vivid and memorable of the person's entire life, compared to which everything outside the cult seems grey and dull and insufficient. Slaanesh's cults are particularly prevalent in two places in the Imperium, the very top and the very bottom. At the top, among the nobility and the wealthy, But they flourish because boredom and the complete satisfaction of ordinary needs creates a desperate search for something more extreme, more immediate, more genuinely felt. At the bottom, in the underhive and the labor districts, they flourish because the contrast between the bleakness of daily existence and the vivid intensity of the cult's gatherings is so overwhelming that people will do almost anything to keep returning to that feeling. The hive worker who feels nothing during their 12-hour shift but comes alive in the cult gathering is not making a rational choice. They are chasing relief from a life that otherwise offers none. The Slaneshian cult's front organizations are typically the most socially legitimate seeming of all: arts patronage organizations, private social clubs, exclusive hospitality venues. With philosophical societies focused on aesthetic theory, they attract the kind of people who have the most to lose from exposure, and who therefore work hardest to maintain the cult's concealment. Section 7. The Word-Bearers, architects of galactic heresy. No discussion of how chaos cults spread in the 41st millennium is complete without talking about the people who, more than any other force in history, are responsible for turning the galaxy into the place it currently is. The faction without whom the Horus heresy might never have happened, without whom the ruin storm would never have been created, was without whom the seeds of heresy planted across the Imperium's 1,000 worlds would never have had the architectural genius behind them to grow into something capable of collapsing the greatest human civilization in history. The Word-Bearers. Sit with that for a moment. The Word-Bearers are the 17th Legion of Space Marines, transhuman warriors created by the Emperor of Mankind, each one a killing machine of staggering capability, each one sworn to protect humanity against all threats. They are the reason that what started as a rebellion by the War Master Horus became something that almost destroyed the entire Imperium. They are the reason there are chaos cults on every inhabited world in the galaxy, and the reason they became this is one of the most compelling, most tragic, and most terrifying stories in all of 40,000 lore. The story starts with a Primarch named Lorgar Aurelian. Lorgar was born, or rather, scattered across the galaxy as an infant by the forces of chaos, as all Primarchs were, and landed on a world called Colchis. He was found there by a priest named Cor Phaeron, who recognized in the infant something extraordinary, and who raised him within a religious tradition that worshipped 4 great powers. Lorgar grew up a preacher, a genuinely gifted, charismatic, deeply sincere preacher, who believed with his entire being that faith was the most important thing a civilization could possess, that the divine should be worshipped with absolute devotion, and that he had been placed in this universe specifically to spread that truth. When the Emperor's fleets arrived and Lorgar was reunited with his father, he became a Space Marine Primarch, but he remained a preacher. He led his legion, now called the Word-Bearers, in the Emperor's Great Crusade to reunite humanity across the stars, and he preached. At every world they brought into imperial compliance, the Word-Bearers built temples and wrote scriptures and delivered sermons that cast the Emperor as a living god, deserving of worship and devotion. The problem, and it is a problem that should make anyone who studies it deeply uncomfortable about the nature of divine authority, is that the Emperor didn't want to be worshipped. The Emperor was explicit that he was not a god, that the imperial truth was a secular worldview based on reason and science, and that superstition and religious devotion were weaknesses to be eradicated, not cultivated. And so one day, yet 100 years into the Great Crusade, the Emperor, accompanied by the Ultramarines Primarch Rabut Guilliman, arrived at the most perfect city the Word-Bearers had built, a city called Monarchia on the world of Kur, and he burned it to the ground. And then he forced Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel in the ash and submit to a formal censure. This moment, the castigation of Kur, it's called, is one of the most important events in the history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, because what the Emperor did that day, whatever his reasoning, was break a man who had devoted his entire existence to sincere faith. He told Lorgar, "Your devotion is wrong, your faith is weakness, your temples are embarrassments, do better, be more useful, stop praying." And Lorgar, brilliant, sensitive, utterly sincere Lorgar, didn't stop believing. Or he just redirected his belief. His lieutenants Erebus and Corpheron, who had been quietly aware of the Chaos God's existence and gradually introducing Lorgar to the primordial truth, seized the moment. They told Lorgar, "The Emperor is not a god. You're right. But there are gods, real ones who actually want to be worshipped, ones who will not burn your work to ash and tell you your devotion was worthless." They led Lorgar on what the lore calls the pilgrimage, a journey into the Eye of Terror itself, where Lorgar encountered the Chaos Gods directly, walked through their realms, and was forever changed. Roughly 43 years before the Horus heresy. That's how long the Wordbearers had to prepare. And what did they do with those 43 years? They planted seeds on every world they conquered during the final phase of the Great Crusade. The Wordbearers didn't just achieve compliance, they secretly spread chaos worship. They embedded cult structures, trained local demagogues, left behind instruction in the arts of heresy, and departed looking every bit like a loyal Space Marine Legion that had finally gotten its act together and was conquering planets at a respectable pace. The worlds that had seemed most efficiently pacified were the ones most thoroughly corrupted. When the Horus heresy finally ignited, those worlds didn't need convincing to rebel. The work had been done years earlier. But the Wordbearers went even further. They spread what were called warrior lodges, initially framed as fraternal organizations. These social clubs for battle brothers who wanted to meet outside formal legion hierarchy, through the other Space Marine legions, and through Horus's inner circle. These lodges were, in most cases, genuine enough in their stated purpose for years. But they also served as the infrastructure for gradually introducing members to increasingly deeper levels of chaos influence. Erebus personally embedded himself with the Sons of Horus as Horus's chaplain, his confessor, his religious advisor, the man who would eventually, on the world of Davin, orchestrate the events that caused Horus to be corrupted by the ruinous powers. This is the Wordbearers' specific genius. They didn't just join chaos. They became the galaxy-wide seed-spreading infrastructure of chaos. They understood, earlier than any other force in history, that an ideology spreads not through direct conversion alone, but through institutional capture, through building, slowly and patiently, the structures within which people make meaning, and then filling those structures with a different meaning. At the Battle of Calth, when the Wordbearers launched their betrayal of the Ultramarines Legion in one of the bloodiest and most treacherous engagements of the Horus heresy, the scope of their cult network was revealed in its fullness. The cultists who flooded Calthe's surface numbered in the millions. They had been placed on those worlds years before. They fought not just as soldiers, but as ritual participants in a vast sacrifice. Every death on Calthe's surface, whether cultist or ultramarine or innocent civilian, was deliberately orchestrated as part of Lorgar's plan to generate the psychic energy needed to create the ruin storm. The cultists weren't just fighting. They were, whether they knew it or not, being used as fuel for a ritual of incomprehensible scale. Even the cultists not killed during the battle were frequently slaughtered by the demons their deaths summoned. The ruinous powers use mortals. They don't keep them. But the Wordbearers' work didn't end with the Horus heresy. In the 10,000 years since, they have continued. Lorgar sits in contemplation on his demon world of Sicarus, his planet covered in an ever-growing structure of misery and worship, and his legion continues the long war, not primarily through direct military action, but through the patient, grinding, world-by-world work of embedding cult networks. There are Wordbearers agents on Imperial worlds right now. There have been for 10,000 years. The galaxy of the 41st Millennium is filled with their seeds. Section 8. The Alpha Legion, the Hydra's unseen hand. If the Wordbearers are the galaxy's most prominent and committed architects of chaos cult infrastructure, then there is another legion that deserves mention in this space. One that operates with a very different philosophy, and whose relationship to the cults they seed is uniquely strange. The Alpha Legion, the 20th Legion, the ones about whom, as their own members are fond of saying, the least is known. The Alpha Legion's relationship to Chaos cults is not primarily driven by religious devotion, it is driven by operational utility. As the Alpha Legion are masters of infiltration, covert operations, misdirection, and psychological warfare, and their approach to cult building reflects this. Where the word-bearers plant cults to spread genuine devotion to the ruinous powers, to genuinely convert populations to the worship of chaos in the sincere hope of reshaping the galaxy's spiritual landscape, the Alpha Legion plants cults primarily as strategic tools. A cult embedded on a planet that the Alpha Legion plans to target creates a ready-made network of agents before the Legion ever fires a shot. It destabilizes the planet's defenses. It provides intelligence on Arbite's patrol patterns and inquisitorial presences. It creates the infrastructure for a coordinated uprising that can coincide with a military strike. And crucially, as it provides the Alpha Legion with plausible deniability, because if the cult is discovered before it completes its purpose, there is no direct link back to the Legion. The Alpha Legion's cult-building philosophy is the one that looks most like what a professional intelligence service would design. The cells are genuinely isolated from each other, not just as a security measure, but as a feature. The Alpha Legion agents who supervise the cult network are usually not identifiable as Alpha Legion. They operate under cover identities so thoroughly constructed that they may have been living as ordinary Imperial citizens for years before being activated for a specific operation. The demagogue at the center of an Alpha Legion-backed cult may genuinely believe they arrived at their heresy independently, as through their own spiritual journey, not knowing that their initial encounter with the Chaos teachings was engineered and their subsequent development was carefully monitored and shaped by agents they never identified as agents. The motto, Hydra Dominatus, refers to the Hydra. If you cut off one head, two more grow in its place. This is how the Alpha Legion approaches its cult networks. The destruction of any individual cell, or even any individual cult, is not a defeat. It is merely the pruning of one branch, which causes two more to grow. The Inquisition has declared the Alpha Legion extinct no fewer than 3 times and been proven wrong every time. Because you cannot kill the Alpha Legion by finding Alpha Legion. You can only kill the Alpha Legion by finding everyone, everywhere, or who has ever been quietly touched by their influence. And that is a task that would require an inquisitorial apparatus several orders of magnitude larger than the one that exists. The Alpha Legion's motivations are also, characteristically, ambiguous. Their twin primarchs Alpharius and Omegon were contacted before the Horus Heresy by a Xenos organization called the Cabal, which claimed to show them the future, and argued that the only way to permanently defeat Chaos was to ensure Horus won the war, because a Chaos victory would burn out so much psychic energy that the ruinous powers would be greatly diminished for eons to come, while an Imperial victory would result in a slow, grinding, 10,000-year decay into something that would eventually feed Chaos anyway. Alpharius and Omegon reportedly accepted this argument and sided with the traitors, but whether they did so sincerely, or whether they were playing a much longer game, is something the lore has never definitively resolved. And given who we're talking about, that ambiguity is exactly the point. Whether the Alpha Legion is truly serving Chaos or using Chaos as a tool towards some other end, the cults they create are real, and the damage they do is real. The fact that their ideological motivations might be different from the word-bearers does not make them any less dangerous to the Imperium. A world destabilized by an Alpha Legion cult is just as lost as one destabilized by a word-bearer's cult. The mechanism is the same, only the architect's intentions differ. This is Section 9, From Seed to Wildfire, the Stages of Cult Growth. Let's trace the full arc. Let's take a hypothetical world, call it any name you like, it could be any of the million worlds in the Imperium, and walk through how a cult goes from a single demagogue with an idea to a planet-devouring organism that can overwhelm an entire Imperial defense force. Stage 1 is the seed. We have already discussed this in some detail. The single initial convert, the personal revelation, the first quiet conversations in trusted company. This stage can last months or years. The cult at this stage is not yet a cult. It is barely a thought, a shared secret between people who are still genuinely uncertain whether they're doing something wrong. What the warp's influence at this stage is subtle. A feeling of warmth when the group gathers, a sense of purpose that wasn't there before, dreams that seem significant, nothing that would alarm a passing inquisitor even if they were present. The first rituals are minimal, a shared meal, a spoken phrase, a particular gesture of greeting, the kind of thing any religious group might do. Stage 2 is cell development. The original small group has grown confident enough to start extending the network. New members are brought in through the front organization, vetted through the cell structure, inducted gradually into deeper levels of understanding. At this stage, the cult likely has somewhere between 50 and a few hundred members across multiple cells, none of which knows the full extent of the organization. The outer layers are still completely plausible as ordinary Imperial citizens with eccentric social connections. The inner layers have begun to engage in actual ritual practice, proper chaos ritual, with specific invocations and offerings, and in some cases, the first deliberate attempts to reach through the warp for contact with something on the other side. This is when the cult starts to show physical marks on its most dedicated members, not dramatic mutations, not yet. But the persistent practitioner of chaos ritual will, over time, develop small changes. The eyes that catch light in a slightly wrong way, a healing ability that is a little too consistent and a little too complete for normal physiology, a resistance to disease or injury that is beyond statistical probability, a psyker's abilities that have grown significantly stronger and less predictable. These are the early gifts, and they are concealed, hidden beneath clothing, managed through behavior, explained away as genetic quirks. Stage 3 is quiet growth, the long middle period of a cult's development that can last decades or even longer. The cult is substantial now. It has hundreds or thousands of members. Its front organizations are genuinely embedded in the community, providing real services and exercising real influence. Its inner circle has achieved a level of genuine warp-based power. The demagogue may now be capable of minor sorcery, or of healing that no medici can explain, or of feats of physical capability that exceed what baseline humans should be able to achieve. What this stage is characterized by an increasingly self-sustaining dynamic. The cult no longer needs to actively seek new members. People come to the front organizations on their own, drawn by the genuine services they provide. And the screening and recruitment process that follows is now deeply practiced and highly efficient. The cult has also begun to infiltrate local institutions, the Planetary Defense Force through members who serve in it, the local administratum through members who work there, the commercial networks through members who run businesses. This infiltration is not primarily about immediate operational utility, though it has that effect. It is about creating a fabric of concealment that the cult can pull around itself if needed. At this stage, if an Arbeits officer becomes suspicious and starts investigating one thread of the network, they will find that the threads lead to nowhere interesting. Records are clean. Witnesses recall nothing unusual. The investigating officer's supervisor is quietly notified by a cult member in the administrative apparatus who has access to internal Arbeits communications, and the investigation is gently redirected. This is not the dramatic, skull and eight-pointed star conspiracy of popular imagination. It is the entirely mundane corruption of institutional process by people who have learned to navigate those processes. It looks exactly like the ordinary bureaucratic inefficiency that characterizes every aspect of imperial governance. Stage 4 is saturation. The cult, at this point, is not a hidden organization embedded in the community. And it is the community, or at least so thoroughly intertwined with every significant aspect of community life, that the distinction is meaningless. The planetary governor may or may not be a member. The senior Arbeits commander is, in at least one case, an inner circle initiate who has been attending full ritual practices for 12 years. The primary commercial guilds are controlled by cult members. The local clergy of the imperial creed has been gradually replaced, one retirement and death and replacement at a time, with people whose doctrinal positions, while formally orthodox, carry a particular emphasis on certain theological points that, to anyone trained in cult identification, would be recognizable flags. At stage 4, the Inquisition's standard intervention tools are severely compromised. As the local Arbites cannot be trusted to conduct an objective investigation, the planetary governor cannot be trusted to authorize a sincere purge. A junior inquisitor who arrives alone on this world and starts asking questions will find, within days, that every avenue of inquiry closes gently but firmly behind them. If they are persistent, they will have an accident. If they are clever, they will realize what they're dealing with in time to transmit a warning before the accident. Stage 4 is where the Inquisition begins talking about surgical strikes versus mass purges, or, in the most extreme cases, about whether any subtler approach is still viable at all. Let me add something here that doesn't often get discussed: the internal politics of the cult itself as it reaches maturity. Because it would be a mistake to imagine a cult in stage 3 or stage 4 as a unified, harmonious organization, all pulling in the same direction. Human nature doesn't stop operating just because people have joined a chaos cult. Ambition doesn't stop. Jealousy doesn't stop. Fear doesn't stop. The cell structure that protects a young cult from discovery becomes, as the cult grows, a source of internal political complexity. Each cell leader has their own relationship with the demagogue. Each cell has developed its own microculture, its own specific interpretation of whatever doctrine is at the center of the cult's theology. The inner circle has inevitably accumulated its own internal hierarchies and resentments. The person who was first, who was there at the very beginning, us who has the longest history of service, may resent newer arrivals who have been given greater gifts. The person who has been given the most spectacular mutations may be viewed with fear and jealousy as much as with reverence. The Chaos Gods, particularly Tzeentch, appear to actively enjoy this. A Tzeentchian cult is especially prone to internal scheming because its patron deity is the god of scheming, and he tends to reward cleverness over seniority. The most politically dexterous member of the inner circle is more likely to advance in a Tzeentchian cult than the most devotionally sincere one. This creates an environment where everyone suspects everyone of plotting because everyone is plotting, because that is literally what serving Tzeentch means. In cornate cults, as internal conflict tends to be more direct, outright physical challenges to leadership, with the strongest fighter claiming authority as the most obviously bloodworthy. This makes cornate cults dynamically unstable in ways that can be either operationally catastrophic or operationally advantageous, depending on whether the leader who wins the inevitable challenge happens to be tactically competent. Nurglite cults, by contrast, tend to have the most stable internal politics of any cult type, which reflects the Plague Lord's slow, patient, endurance-oriented nature. Nurgle's cultists help each other, support each other, share their gifts with each other. The hierarchy is flatter, the community bonds are genuinely strong, and the internal disagreements tend to be managed through discussion rather than violence. This makes Nurglite cults, as paradoxically, the most community-like and in some ways the hardest to infiltrate, because the bonds of genuine care and mutual support make it far harder for an inquisitorial plant to maintain the emotional distance necessary for clean intelligence gathering. All of this internal complexity means that what an inquisitor encounters when they begin investigating a mature cult is not a simple hierarchical organization with a clear command structure that can be decapitated. It is a tangle, a web of relationships and histories and internal politics and mutual obligations that has to be understood in its full complexity before effective action is possible, which takes time. And time is what the cult is always trying to run out on behalf of the Inquisitor. Section 10. The Gifts of Chaos, Mutation, Reward, and the Chaos Spawn. We need to talk about what the Chaos Gods actually give their followers, because understanding the gifts is essential to understanding why the cults hold together. and what ultimately happens to most of the people in them. The ruinous powers are not stingy with their rewards. This is one of the things that makes them so dangerous. A dedicated cultist who serves faithfully and advances through the ranks of their cult is likely to receive genuine, tangible, demonstrable evidence of divine favor in the form of mutation, enhanced physical capability, psychic awakening, or more specific gifts appropriate to their patron deity. Cornate cultists develop extraordinary strength and pain tolerance. Our Nurglite cultists develop immunity to disease and a regenerative capability that would seem miraculous by ordinary standards. Sentient cultists develop psychic gifts or begin to perceive patterns in the flow of events that give them genuine predictive capability. Slayer-Neshian cultists develop enhanced senses, physical agility, and a capacity for both delivering and experiencing sensation that is genuinely beyond normal human ability. These are real. This is not placebo. The warp is a real place, and entities from it can genuinely reshape physical reality for individuals who have established a strong enough connection to it. The problem, the trap, is that chaos mutations are not stable, they are not predictable, and the chaos gods do not feel, in any mortal sense, a commitment to their servants' well-being. Says the mark of chaos, the specific blessing or curse that a chaos god places on a devoted follower is always meaningful to the receiving deity. It is not always beneficial to the receiver. A cornate warrior might receive a mutation that increases their physical power, but removes any remaining capacity for abstract thought. A Nurglite follower might receive new gifts of disease that are visually so obvious that they can no longer move among ordinary people. A Tsinchian sorcerer might receive a surge of mutational energy that transforms them into something that is no longer recognizably human in any functional sense. A Slayer-Neshian devotee might find their senses so overwhelmed by enhancement that ordinary reality is permanently unbearable. And then there is the ultimate expression of chaos's unreliability, the chaos spawn. The chaos spawn is what happens when a cultist, or more frequently a dedicated chaos champion, receives so many mutations, so many gifts, so many blessings from their patron that the accumulated weight of the warp's touch breaks whatever coherence their body and mind originally possessed and leaves something that is alive but no longer functional as anything except an expression of raw chaos energy. A chaos spawn is not a person. It is not a monster with goals or plans or motivations. It is a writhing, constantly mutating mass of tissue and bone and warp-touched biology that attacks anything it encounters with whatever limbs it currently possesses, which may change from moment to moment. One of the inquisitorial files on chaos cults contain photographs, pics, of what were once humans who pursued the chaos god's favor with sufficient dedication to trigger this terminal transformation. They are not pleasant viewing. The spawn retains nothing of what it was. It doesn't remember its name, its family, its reasons for following the path it chose. It is simply a wound in the fabric of reality that happens to be ambulatory. The chaos gods watch the creation of chaos spawn with something that might be interpreted as pleasure, because the spawn, in its mindless thrashing, continues to generate the emotions and the violence and the suffering that feed its patron. It remains useful, even in this form. This is the honest truth of chaos worship, that the demagogues who seduce new members into the cult don't tell them at the beginning. As the gifts are real, the power is real. And for a select few, those who please their patron god sufficiently, who have the specific combination of ability and luck and circumstance, the final reward is ascension to demonhood, an actual transformation into a powerful chaos demon, and the achievement of genuine immortality. But for everyone who achieves demonhood, dozens become spawns. The path up is narrow, the fall off it is wide, and the chaos gods do not feel this as a failure, they feel it as appropriate. Those who know this and continue down the path anyway, and there are always those who know and continue, are perhaps the most interesting psychological study in all of 40K. They are people who have decided that the chance of becoming something divine is worth the risk of becoming a spawn. or people who have gone so deep into the cult's structures, have done so many things they cannot take back, that they have decided the only direction remaining is forward, or people who have genuinely fallen in love with their god, in the way that devotees fall in love with their deities, and who trust that their grandfather, or their lord of change, or their dark prince will not let them fall, a trust that is, statistically, misplaced, but which feels so real in the experiencing of it that logic cannot displace it. Section 11. The Witch Hunters and the Endless Hunt. The institution tasked with finding and destroying these cults before they reach the later stages of development is the Ordo Hereticus, the Witch Hunters. They are the largest of the three major ordos of the Inquisition because their job is the largest, the protection of the Imperium from the enemy within. An Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor is one of the most powerful single human beings in the Imperium. They operate above the authority of planetary governors, above the local arbites, above the ecclesiarchy clergy, above virtually every other institution except the Adeptus Astartes and sometimes each other. They can commandeer ships, personnel, and materiel. They can order executions without trial. They can declare a world in a state of heretical emergency and thereby unlock an apparatus of response that includes the Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Sororitas militant orders, as well as whatever military forces the Inquisitor can requisition. They are, despite this extraordinary power, systematically overwhelmed by the scale of the problem they face. Consider 1 million worlds, tens of billions of people per world. One Inquisitor, even with a full warband of acolytes, experts and supporting agents, can actively investigate perhaps a handful of worlds simultaneously. They rely on informant networks, citizens who report suspected cult activity to Arbite stations or, for more serious suspicions, directly to designated inquisitorial contacts. But the cult, as we have discussed, is structured to prevent informants from having access to information that would make their reports actionable. The outer ring member who might become suspicious has no knowledge of the inner circle, and the inner circle member who knows the truth is so thoroughly committed, socially and spiritually and experientially, was that they have no interest in betraying the cult. The methods the Ordo Hereticus uses to detect cults fall into several categories. The first is pattern analysis, looking for statistical anomalies in social, medical, commercial, or demographic data that might indicate cult activity, an unexpected decline in a district's disease rates that isn't explained by any official medicate intervention, a commercial guild whose revenue pattern doesn't match its stated activities, a neighborhood whose population seems to be aging slightly slower than the statistical models predict, a ward where the rate of missing persons reports has been quietly elevated for years but never aggregated into a report visible to senior arbites. This kind of analysis requires both access to data and the training to know what patterns are significant, and the Ordo Hereticus has developed, over millennia, an extraordinarily sophisticated capacity for both. Their acolytes include data scholars, whose entire purpose is to sit with planetary records and look for the tells. The problem is that the later stage cult, as we've discussed, has already compromised the record-keeping apparatus. The data has been quietly cleaned. The second method is infiltration. An Inquisitor's warband will often include individuals with backgrounds that allow them to embed convincingly in cult-vulnerable social environments. Former Underhive residents, former soldiers, former clergy. These infiltrators are extraordinarily skilled and extraordinarily brave, because if they are identified, well, their fate is not arrest and trial. Cults do not extend mercy to people they identify as Imperial agents. The infiltrator's goal is to work their way into a cult's outer ring, and then carefully, slowly, without triggering the cult's security protocols, move deeper until they can identify enough of the structure to give an Inquisitor actionable intelligence. The third method is what the Ordo Hereticus calls surgical precision, the targeted extraction or elimination of key figures within a cult's leadership structure, the demagogue, the inner circle, while leaving the outer ring members alive for questioning. This is delicate work. Cut off the head of a cult cleanly enough, and you can interrogate the remaining members. map the full structure, and roll up the entire network. Do it wrong, too visible, or too obviously a military operation, and the cells that don't know enough to reveal information about each other go to ground simultaneously, destroy their identifying materials, and the whole thing becomes invisible again until it reconstitutes around a new leadership. The fourth method is mass purge, simply removing everyone in an affected area and sorting through the survivors. This is crude, enormously expensive in lives and resources, deeply unpopular with planetary governors who see their labor force being eliminated, and creates its own social conditions that can breed new cult activity. But in cases where the infection has reached stage 4, where surgical options are no longer viable, it is sometimes the only approach short of the last resort. The last resort, exterminatus, or the total destruction of the planetary biosphere, or, in the most extreme cases, the destruction of the planet itself, to prevent the cult's full uprising and the daemonic incursion that follows it. Every inquisitor who authorizes exterminatus lives with that decision. Every one of them carries the weight of the billions of lives ended by that choice. The calculus that preserving those lives now would allow a demonic breach that would kill far more and potentially contaminate neighboring systems is not a comfort. It is simply the conclusion that a mind trained in inquisitorial logic arrives at when all other options are gone. The Ordo Hereticus has authorized exterminatus more times than the official records acknowledge, and each time the event is filed quietly, the records sealed, and the galaxy continues rotating. Section 12. The Uprising. When the mask finally drops, now we arrive at the moment that every chaos cult is, at some level, building toward. The moment when the patience ends, when the concealment is abandoned, when the quiet network of cells and front organizations and carefully corrupted officials suddenly tears aside its cover and reveals itself as something vast and organized and overwhelmingly violent. The uprising. Not all cult uprisings are the same. Some are planned with precision, triggered at a specific moment, coordinated across the planet's surface, timed to coincide with an external event that the cult's inner circle knows is coming. A Chaos Space Marine fleet approaching from the Eye of Terror, for example. As if the cult can create sufficient chaos, the other kind, the lowercase kind, the simple meaning of the word, on the planet's surface at the moment the fleet arrives. The planetary defense forces are divided between external and internal threats, and neither front receives adequate resources. Others happen because the cult has grown too large and too visible to maintain concealment any longer. The outer ring members who were genuinely innocent have started to notice things they can't explain. An inquisitorial investigation has gotten close enough that the inner circle has made the calculation that it's better to move now, while they have the element of surprise, than to wait for the Inquisitor to gather enough evidence for a formal intervention. The mechanics of the uprising are genuinely terrifying. Because the cultists don't look like an army. They look, until the moment the signal is given, exactly like ordinary citizens. The outer ring members, who are often the majority of the visible front organizations, are frequently not told what is about to happen. They are given a signal and a simple instruction. When you hear this, go here and do this. They don't know the full plan. They just know their small piece of it. And then the signal comes. Within hours, the planetary infrastructure begins to collapse. Not because the cultists are necessarily better fighters than the defense forces. They usually aren't. But because they're everywhere. The manufactorum workers who stop their machines at a coordinated moment. The transport network crews who simply don't show up, with the power grid workers who disable specific substations in a sequence that cascades into a broader blackout, the Arbeits officers who are cult members and who, in the confusion of the first hours, respond to incidents at locations that conveniently do not include the locations where the real action is happening. The cult's weapons come out of hiding. For years, ammunition and armament have been cached in locations throughout the planet's surface, stolen from PDF supply lines, salvaged from decommissioned equipment, manufactured quietly in workshops that looked like small-scale production facilities. It's not military-grade equipment mostly, solid-shot weapons, autoguns, improvised flamers. But there are a lot of it, and the cultists have been drilling with it, in private, for a long time. The ritual component of the uprising is something that the Inquisition discusses in documents that are classified above the level of most planetary governors. Because the cultists are not just fighting, they are performing. The deaths occurring on the battlefield, both the enemies they kill and the cultists who die, are all, in a sense, offerings. The demagogues who lead the uprising are conducting a vast ritual that uses the violence of the uprising itself as the psychic fuel for a specific purpose, thinning the boundary between real space and the warp in the planet's local vicinity. If the ritual is performed at sufficient scale, with sufficient deaths, the boundary thins enough that demons can push through. Not en masse, not yet, but enough to begin reinforcing the cultists with something genuinely terrifying to face in combat. And if the ritual reaches its culmination, if the cultists maintain control of a significant portion of the planet's surface long enough to complete the full working, a proper warp rift can open, which is when the situation changes from a desperate internal security situation to something that may require the involvement of entire Space Marine chapters to address. And if the traitor Legion fleet is waiting outside the system, this is when they descend. Because here is something important. The Chaos Space Marines who arrive to support the cult uprising are not there as allies, not exactly. They are there as generals. The cultists' role in the broader strategic picture is to soften the planet's defenses, to create the conditions for invasion, and to provide the ritual infrastructure for demonic manifestation. Also, the Chaos Space Marines' role is to win the war that the cultists have started. And if the cultists die in the process, that is not particularly concerning to the traitor legions, because the cultists have already served their primary purpose. They were always, from the Chaos God's perspective, a means to an end. This is the fundamental truth about what chaos does with the mortals who serve it. Section 13. The Aftermath. What chaos does with its tools. If the cult uprising succeeds, if the planetary government is overthrown, if the chaos forces establish control, if the world falls to the ruinous powers, what happens to the cultists who made it all possible? Whilst this is the part of the story that the demagogues who recruit new members very carefully do not discuss in the initial stages of induction, the honest answer, documented in enough recovered inquisitorial case files to constitute a clear pattern, is not good. Some cultists, the most powerful, the most capable, the ones with genuine gifts from their patron deity or specific skills that remain useful, are folded into the Chaos Space Marine warbands as auxiliaries. They become the mortal troops who fight alongside the heretic Astartes, who operate the material that the transhuman warriors find beneath their dignity to touch, who provide the numerical mass that can be thrown at defensive positions while the Space Marines themselves do the precision work. These cultists are not slaves exactly, and they retain autonomy, and they are genuinely part of the organization, but their status is low, their lives are disposable, and they are entirely aware of both these facts. Many cultists are taken back to the Eye of Terror, or to the Maelstrom, or to any of the other warp-adjacent hellscapes that the Chaos factions call home, where they join the population of demon worlds. These are worlds where reality has been so thoroughly subsumed by warp energy that the laws of physics are suggestions rather than rules, where time flows in multiple directions, where the landscape changes based on the emotional state of the inhabitants, where suffering is not incidental to existence, but is instead essentially built into the architecture of the place. The cultist who dreamed of serving their god and receiving divine rewards spends the rest of their existence, which may be very long indeed, time being unreliable in the eye, as part of this suffering infrastructure. The worst outcomes are the ones that the cult's own theology doesn't prepare members for. The cultist who has dedicated decades of their life, who has worked with absolute sincerity, who has done genuinely terrible things in service of their god. This cultist might, in the aftermath of a successful uprising, encounter one of the very demons they helped summon. And that demon does not recognize them, does not acknowledge their service, does not care about their devotion. The demon wants food, wants the emotional energy of human suffering, and a sincere devotee is just as edible as any random victim. Whilst the Chaos Gods are not, in any sense, that a mortal would recognize, grateful, they are not even aware, at the individual level, of the vast majority of the mortals who serve them. The mortal experience of serving Chaos is one of profound unilateral devotion, of love and fear and service directed towards something that is genuinely immense and genuinely powerful, but which experiences individual mortals the way an ocean experiences a single wave. The wave is part of the ocean. The ocean doesn't remember the wave when it breaks. This is the honest eschatology of Chaos worship. You serve, you receive gifts, or you become a spawn. You die or are transformed. And the Chaos Gods continue, unchanged, undiminished, already planning the next uprising on the next world. And already whispering the first whisper to the next desperate person in the next underhive cellar on the next planet in the million worlds of the Imperium. And yet, and this is the part that stays with you if you sit with the lore long enough, the cultists keep coming. Every generation produces new ones. Every world that has its uprising suppressed and its leaders executed and its membership scattered finds. Within a generation, the seeds of the next cult beginning to grow in the space the last one left behind. Because the conditions don't change. The Imperium's fundamental architecture doesn't change. The desperation doesn't change. The desire for something more than the grinding misery of ordinary imperial existence doesn't change. The Chaos Gods are patient in the way that only immortal entities can be patient. Well, they have been doing this for 10,000 years. They will be doing this for 10,000 more. And the Inquisition will burn and suppress and investigate and purge, and new cults will grow from the ash. And the cycle will continue because the only way to stop it would be to change the conditions that create it. And that would require changing the Imperium. And changing the Imperium is the one thing that the Imperium's own logic makes nearly impossible to do. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in the spaces between the wars, in the hab blocks and the underhives, and the upper spires and the manufactoria, there are whispers. There are always whispers. Closing. And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive into one of the most most unsettling and most endlessly complex aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore. What I hope you take away from this isn't just the mechanics, the cell structures and the bone brands and the stages of cult growth, but the deeper picture of what Chaos cults represent in the 40,000 universe. They are not random, they are not irrational. They are the logical consequence of a civilization that demands everything from its people and gives them back just enough to survive on, in a universe where genuinely powerful entities have spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of offering alternatives. The Word-bearers planted the seeds. The Alpha Legion continues to tend them for strategic purposes. The conditions the Imperium itself creates provide the soil, and the Chaos Gods, patient, vast, incomprehensible, were hungry, wait in the warp for the moment when the door opens from the inside. Every world that falls, every cult that completes its uprising, every inquisitor who has to write a report that ends with Exterminatus authorized. These are not failures of the individuals involved. They are the predictable output of a system that cannot fix the thing at its core because that would require it to look honestly at what it is. That's the horror. Not just of the 40,000 universe, but of what it reflects about the real world and the real conditions under which people make desperate choices. The best grimdark fiction doesn't just show you a universe that is dark. It shows you why that darkness makes a specific, terrible kind of sense. If you made it all the way through this video, thank you, genuinely. And this is the kind of lore that I love diving into. And if you want more of it, more deep dives, more narrative explorations of the corners and edges of the 40K universe, then hitting subscribe means you'll be here when the next one drops. And if there's a specific topic you want to see covered, leave it in the comments. The lore is vast. There's always more to explore. This has been Q on 40K. Stay safe out there. The Inquisition doesn't need to know you were watching this.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.